It's been a month since I've started this YouTube shtick, so I thought I'd take it easy and take a run at the current climate of race relations in the country. Now, I say country loosely because I'm talking about London. Anyone that has stepped foot in London, and then anywhere else in the country, will know this place is a different type of creature. Let's just call it the city-state of London. Anyway, I guess I'm stalling because it's a bit of a serious subject. As you can tell, I'm not the most serious person in the world, but it is an important time, and an important conversation that we should all be a part of. As a white male in his late 20s who seems only vaguely Asian, there may not be much to be said between the "I'm not racist but" and the "I feel guilty for being white." The truth might be that that is exactly correct, but I don't think so. I know what you're thinking. Famous last words. They're up there with "What's that smell?" and "Don't worry, I know how to fly a plane." The thing is, it might be that very self-validating prelude to the conversation at hand that is stopping the conversation that should have been had consistently for the past decade or so. There seems to be a self-cut-off point, depending on your background, which level of topic you can safely discuss. This is largely self-inflicted. Not that I'm much better, kinda swept myself into a corner there. What I can say 100% for sure, however, is that it is partially correct, kind of-ish. In the book, How to Think Like an Anthropologist, one of the key points of modern anthropology is that you have to be aware of perspective. As ironic as using an academic discipline born from colonialism and imperialism that has evolved by looking at itself and challenging its idea of what the status quo of anthropology actually is, this can help be described by why and how things change over time by the Overton Window, or the window of acceptability, coined by Joseph P. Overton, who died at the age of 43 from, and I didn't know this when I wrote the famous last words line, piloting and crashing a plane. The Matrix keeps glitching out around me. The universe's systems update really is overdue by now. The Overton Window dictates what is politically acceptable by the current status quo's recent arguments that are believed to be correct at the time. This ebbs and flows as new arguments push the borders of the window into new and old territories of thought. I first came across this in the book, The Establishment and How They Get Away With It. Definitely well worth a read. Fundamentally, anthropology is the study of people, cultures, and ultimately society, with an emphasis of our place in it. The problem with looking at a culture and seeing an objective truth is unattainable, at least in the context of objective truth. To observe something from your perspective has everything that has made you, you, which also has a footprint in how you observe and perceive. Now, I don't want to tell you you're not an individual. You are, and you're beautiful the way you are. Yes, even you, Keith. Ah, thanks. I really needed to hear that. But depending on what society you have had most exposure to has a great deal of sway over your viewpoints. I'm going to try and explain some political philosophy without it sounding as boring as its namesake. The government has repressive state apparatuses, which come under things like governing bodies, courts, police, and armed forces. This is what is referred to as hard power, but what I am more interested in is soft power, or ideological state apparatuses. These relate to the religious, educational, family, legal, political, communications, and cultural systems that run our everyday lives. These systems aren't inherently bad or good. If you had to actively think about all of these things and come up with a novel way of executing them on a day-to-day basis, you wouldn't be able to function. The old white man that came up with these terms was called Louis Althusser. They were originally created as a critique of democratically capitalist West systems from the perspective of Marxism. Don't let that detract away from the usefulness of understanding the world we currently experience ourselves in today. Ideological state apparatuses give us a framework of understanding why certain things are the way they are in reality without having to do a ton of thinking. There lies the problem with systematic problems. You can just say things like, the media always puts a biased spin on the truth, without having to argue why that's acceptable or what's inherently wrong about letting it happen. Using some 18th century prison architecture, I want to help describe why ideological state apparatuses hold so much power over us as individuals in society using a badly drawn visual metaphor. The panopticon prison was made so that a single guard could physically look at any and all inmates, while the inmates can't tell whether or not they are being watched. This in turn makes the inmates regulate their behavior because they don't know when they are being watched. Pointedly, panopticon prisons painfully promote paranoia. Please, stop with the little beep generation. In the same way that panopticon prisons regulate inmate behavior, ideological state apparatuses regulate individuals individuals within society. I know this sounds like I'm likening the free people that experience reality in society as prisoners. I'm actually comparing you, the people, more to the guard, if you're in the middle, and the ideological state apparatuses are mirrors, but only mirroring that one aspect of your identity in the context of society, and you police yourself accordingly when, like most of the time, you're on autopilot and not thinking about the injustices of the world and your place in it. When you do come to actually start thinking about it and start trying to be discerning with your belief structure of life, this is when you start to uncover the inconsistencies you live by. These inconsistencies, of which there are many, are the things that need to be talked about and changed. In doing so, you start to change the pillars of society that are the ideological state apparatuses, one of which that has been desperately crying out for attention is the education system. For this is where we learn the majority of our beliefs in society. This is a tricky problem to solve because the modern education system is a century-old factory that churns out workers, not free thinkers, shakers, and movers. The fact that anyone comes out of school, at least the schooling of my generation and before, has an original thought staggers me every time I think about it. That being said, there is a relatively new player to the game that threatens the whole concept of top-down ideological apparatuses. The new kid on the block is, of course, the internet, and it is chunky. The implementation of the internet as an education system, apart from already having its proof of concept forcibly thrust upon it by the pandemic, will challenge the status quo of understanding society, not just for education, but for every facet of ideological state apparatuses that were held over us collectively for so long. The future is getting murkier to see what potential outcomes lay ahead of us. Now that I've instilled some ambiguous moral and mortal dread into your soul, I want to talk about potential paths we can go down in absolutes. On one hand, you have Utopia, a place that is perfect in every way, while on the other hand, you have Northwest Kent, a place where everything is imperfect in every way. I do of course mean dystopia. In the book Utopia for Realists, the point is made that Utopia is an impossible shore to sail to. When sights are set on the idea of a utopia and you get to the horizon, the utopia has moved. If you were to look at the current time, you would be in the midst of a utopian view not even 50 years ago. The two eventualities of dystopias and utopias are more a thought experiment from the current vantage point, a subjective perspective of the time and place you find yourself in. Human suffering is an endless well you can draw from, or it can be lessened in one way or another. Now we know, in the context at least, absolutes are falsehoods that we should be wary of. Awareness is practically infinite, but our own subjective realities are constrained, historically, to the times we reside in. The current era is rife with misunderstandings, accidentally and strategically purposeful. One of the books I recently read, Talking to Strangers and What We Should Know About the People We Don't, looks into a multitude of different reasons why humans get the wrong end of the stick so much. This is a good book to read in this climate of racial discussions that gives quite an enlightening view of why we see things the way we do. It's put into context the death of Sandra Bland in police custody that led onto the Black Lives Matter movement in America. Now, there is a lot to unpack in the book itself, but the main aspect of it that I want to focus on is the notion of defaulting to truth. Evolutionarily speaking, when someone ran into your camp screaming, "Wolves!" it was safer to believe them. Social cohesion relies on defaulting to truth, allowing things in society to run smoothly. Now, there is a lot to say about the police, especially now. Enforcement of law takes the opposite stance on defaulting to truth. I mean, if the police believed everything you told them, then we'd be in an extreme shit show, as opposed to the mediocre one that we find ourselves in today. The law has basically systemized doubt, which, like I just said, is a necessary evil, though, like the NHS at the moment, I don't envy their position. When you systemize doubt from the perspective of everything I've just been speaking about, you can begin to understand just how much of a problem systemic racism is. Now, that all being said, I have personally come up against some annoyances on that big fat chunk we all call the internet. I wouldn't necessarily call myself the most woke individual in the world. In fact, I wouldn't use the word woke anyway. I mean, what's wrong with just being plain old self-aware? Anyway, somewhere in the mid-2010s, I took my finger off the pulse of live media and was rewarded by a general sense of happiness. So, my wokeness level, due to osmosis, may have slipped somewhat. Enter the woke as fake human. From here on out, will be referred to as WAFs. And yes, I appreciate creating yet another subcategory of subcategories of an in and out group is somewhat self-defeating. But I feel a distinction between wanting to educate yourself on any number of topics for self-development and personal understanding, against winning at knowledge and using it as a sword of self-righteousness to slay the unwokest of society. Begrudgingly, however, I see this multitude of bickering voices of WAFs as the sails of the ship that is heading for the potential horizons. Not to say they really have a direction, other than just away from whatever the current topic is at that time, which in itself is its own ignorance. But how many times can you say ignorance in one sentence without ignorance starting to lose its own meaning? Ignorance. It is really down to us mere mortals, the unwefs, to take hold of the steering wheel. We want to arrive at the shores of a future utopia of mutual respect and self-awareness. We don't want to arrive at a dystopian shores littered with eggshells and self-censorship. The government has a lot of hard power with the repressive state apparatuses, but people can choose to have more power. Yeah, we have one vote in this democracy, but we vote every day with our voices, our actions, and most powerfully against the establishment, we vote with our money. If you have the will and the means, donate. I've left some relevant charities in the description below. See you next Tuesday.